Weston, we're probably rolling, right? I presume we've been rolling for a while. Okay, cool. Well, then there's no reason to make it awkward. But Seth Denson, let's actually greet you. How are you, sir?
I'm good, buddy. Good to be with you.
Good, man. We were talking cookies. We were talking bourbon, the fun stuff, right? But I think we got to talk about self-funded a little bit.
Well, it's not fun about that.
Yeah, I know. It's pretty fun. Not as fun as bourbon, I don't think, but we'll make do.
One leads to another oftentimes.
Yeah. I should have had some bourbon like I was Joe Rogan. We'd probably have a little bit more
it's
fun.
Only like, what, 9 in the morning?
Is that what time it is? No, yeah. That's not when you start? Okay. But anyways, so Seth, appreciate you coming, man. Definitely thanks for fitting this in your schedule. I know you are a man that is, you were telling me earlier, sometimes it's 6 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night with everything you got going on. But how do you keep this schedule all the time? I got to know. Is there a secret to energy or like?
Listen, first of all, I think that if you love and are passionate about what you're doing, it's easy to get the energy up to do it.
Sure.
I'm not passionate about sleep, so I don't require a lot of it. Yep. I've always been that way. Now, that being said, it's interesting. It's almost like a fuel tank in a vehicle. That's what sleep is to me. So I'm going to run that sucker all the way down, and then I got to reboot it. So, sometimes as I get older, that reboot needs to happen more often than it used to.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, listen, a typical day for me starts at 4:30. Okay. But in fairness, by 9:30 at night, I'm done. I mean, I'm out. Mm-hmm. And so I've always been wired that way. I'm not a late night guy. I don't like to be a late night guy. You want to do dinner with me? Great. I'm all for the blue light special at Luby's. Let's go. Yep. I've been that way since I was a teenager. So, but mornings are my time. I love early mornings. Now, the challenge for me now is a lot of times I'll do a news hit at night. On the same day that I'll do a news hit early in the morning. That makes for, like yesterday, for example, I was on live at 6:30 a.m.
But 6:30 start time, but when are you getting prep for that? 4:30?
Well, yeah, because you get topics typically, and I wish we get questions, but we actually just get topics. You have to kind of make yourself ready to be able to talk about whatever it is that they're going to be wanting to talk about. So typically 4:30, at least 2 hours before whatever my hit time is, I need to be up. Okay. And so, the reality is, though, of course, we're in Texas, so that's Central Time. New York, an hour later. Mm-hmm. A lot of times I pull that 5:30 hits. That's 6:30 in New York. That's when a lot of the morning shows, whether that's Fox and Friends, whether that's Wake Up America on NewsMax, which I do a lot, those go live at 6:30. So for those days, it's a 4 a.m. wake-up call. I'll try to stretch it to 4 a.m. because that means I'm on at 5:30. It's about a 20-minute drive to the studio for me. And so, it makes for an early morning, a long day when you have to do a nighttime interview at the end of that.
Yeah, that's what I said. Certainly respect the drive, right? I mean, I woke up at 5:30 today, which is if all things being equal, my preference is my time in the morning, right? That sort of dead space in the house where everybody's still asleep and it's dark and it's quiet and I've got my coffee. It hasn't been quite the same with a 8-month-old that is still not sleeping all the way through, and so we're working on that. But yeah, like I'm kind of wired like you. I will fall asleep sometimes 9:30, 10 o'clock, but then I'm raring to go at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm just awake if I've gotten sufficient sleep. So I don't need that 8 hours. Give me 6, good, and I'm ready to rock. But, we've obviously talked about a lot of your media stuff. That's not everything that you do, and certainly I think the thing that we'll cover today is fascinating from my perspective. The captive space is something that I perceive you, and you obviously are an expert in that space. But can we learn more about you, your trajectory, your work history, personal, if you want to share, because you weren't always doing the media stuff beforehand. You also built a successful business. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, we could take up the entire podcast kind of walking through the life's journey with Seth, but I'll avoid that. I'll give you the
you can pare it down a little bit.
Beyond Reader's Digest version. So, interestingly enough, so growing up, I grew up out in West Texas where everyone pretty much is in the oil and gas business, directly or indirectly. My father was pastor of a church, and we jokingly say, well, he was in the oil and gas business because church attendance very much aligned with how many people, what was going on with the oil and gas business. But nonetheless, so when I went into college, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I changed my majors a number of times, and I had a great guidance counselor after like the 5th time I changed my major, who pulled me aside and said, first of all, Seth, you don't have to declare anything at this point, but I've never been wired to not have a goal or something I'm working towards. So I said, I recognize that, Miss Reed, but I got to have something I'm working towards. She said, okay, well, what do you want to do? I said, I have no idea. She said, what do you like to do? I said, I really like to play golf. She said, well, that's great. How good are you? I'm like, well, I'm terrible. I'm an 18 handicap on a good day, and there's not many good days for me. I'm a former baseball player, so I swing a golf club like a baseball bat.
Yep.
And so she said, all right, here's what you're going to do. Go down to the local golf course on like a Wednesday afternoon, middle of the day, and ask them what the guys that are playing golf on a Wednesday in the middle of the day, what they do for a living.
Yeah.
Because whatever that is, that's what you do. And to my surprise, they were all in the financial services and insurance business. So immediately I went and I got an internship working for a financial firm. And I, at the time, so this was 2000, was handed the insurance desk because that was the thing that nobody had to ever worry about because it was just easy. You just renew it and you move on. So it was the thing that the interns always got to work on. I quickly gravitated towards it. Now, this is the part of the story where I tell you, I grew up without health insurance. My father being the pastor of a church, we just didn't have it in the church budget to provide health insurance. And so for me, it was this unique world of understanding, oh, this is how health insurance works. Here's what it is. And I was fascinated by it because when my father would need health care for us, notice I said health care, not health insurance. When he needed health care for us, he would go negotiate cash prices with the doctors. Or, hey, do you need some work done around your house? Can I come do it for you? I mean, there was always something that he would do. I remember one time in my life growing up, and I needed a surgery. My father went and got a job during the week, because obviously he was preaching on the weekends. And I always joke, he used to always joke, he's like, you know, I only work an hour a week, and if I work a full hour, people get mad at me, especially if there's a Cowboys game on. So jokingly, the pastor's work is never done, but nonetheless, he got this job. And so this whole idea of how health insurance works intrigued me. So I became very quickly immersed in it, realized you can make a really good living in it, and did make a really good living for about a decade until I had what my friends and colleagues call my Jerry Maguire moment, which is, hey, this system kind of is broken.
Okay.
I
thought your Jerry Maguire moment was going to be the show me the money because you're like, oh, I want to, like, where's the money?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, listen, that was the first 10 years.
What
I played a lot of golf in that
no.
first 10 years. Let's just put it that way. My handicap got really good in that first 10 years of the business. But about 10 years into the business, I had that epiphany of, hey, you know, there's a different way of approaching this, and we could do it better. And so I had that moment, and that was when I left the firm I was with to say, I'm going to do this different. And so that was 2011.
Okay.
I very quickly thereafter got into the captive space, recognizing that was a unique tool to accomplish the things that I thought we could do in the healthcare space. And I've been doing it ever since. And so for you know, when I left the firm I was at and started what is now GDP Advisors, about a year into that, I realized I'm figuring out this healthcare thing pretty well. I don't know how to run a business. So that's when I partnered with my still business partner, John Powder, who was a brilliant businessman, still is. His most brilliant move ever was partnering with me. I like to say that.
Yeah, I agree.
But nonetheless, it was one of those where we came together very much Mutt and Jeff, but made it work. And that the things that I did really well, I was able to bring to the table things he did really well, he brought to the table, and when you put them together, man, magic happened. And so we quickly grew a firm from this to this, and are still growing today and loving every day of what we do.
Yeah, and you built something really, really special, man. And so I don't have to tell you, but kudos to that. You guys have done an awesome job. Yeah, say hello to John for me as well. He's one of my favorite people. So captives, though, I'm curious. You know, we'll get into kind of the subject matter. You know, we're venturing into the space of all things self-funded, and there's so many solutions out there. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So my goal is to interview folks that have a different area of expertise or a different lane that they operate in. Doesn't mean that's all you do, of course, but it's something that you have identified as an avenue for which to differentiate yourself, right? So help me define, what is a captive? What, you know, when people hear that, or hey, they're in a captive, or I'm building a captive, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, because I think there's a lot of confusion around it. And again, we in this business love to try to make things complex. I think it makes us feel smart.
Yeah.
But the reality is, a captive is, in its simplistic form, is the pooling of multiple entities or things or whatever. It's a pooling component. Now, there's certainly some legal jargon around a true legal captive and how that works. Now it's filed, but you know, there's captives in the PNC side. There's captives in the health side. And I think that a lot of times people think they're exactly the same, and there's certainly some characteristics that are similar, but they're structured very differently. Here's the reality, and I say this all the time: if you're in the group health insurance business, as a user, as an employer, you're in a captive. Unless you're like Time Warner or ExxonMobil.
A jumbo.
Exactly. You're in a captive. You just don't know it. So as you know, Spencer, and you get, I love this podcast, by the way. You're doing some great stuff here. But
thank you.
There's really two types of funding mechanisms when it comes to insurance, right? You have fully insured and you have self-funded. We can talk about the different layers of those things, level funded, captives, all these other things. But the reality is there's two types. Under ERISA, two types of ways to finance your health plan. You can fully insure it or you can self-fund it. That's it. And so the idea here is that a captive is really just a grouping of employers. Now, most captives, or many captives, I should say, on the health plan side, allow the employers to share risk in a layer. So every health insurance policy, whether fully insured or self-funded, has really three key layers, right? You have administrative cost. It costs somebody something to print the pretty little white ID cards and process the claims. You have the actual claims funding, and then you have the reinsurance layer. Right? So the reinsurance layer being for mid-market employers, somewhere 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 200,000. For major employers or jumbo employers, I mean, you're getting up into really big layers, and maybe they don't do specific, maybe they do aggregate, or they only do aggregate and not specific, right? Yep. I mean, there's different ways of doing that, right? But in the underwriting world, we live in a world called that surrounds itself with what's called credibility, right? Forecastability. And I used to say this from an underwriting perspective. How clear is my crystal ball? Can I see into the future? And that's what underwriters want to know. And so early on in my career, I was really fortunate. I got to train alongside some fantastic underwriters. And early on in my career, when I was trying to learn the business, I recognized that when all the other salespeople went to the bar, I would go to the third floor. You know, the third floor that had the really nasty neon lights or fluorescent lights and no windows, because that's where all the underwriters were. Yeah. And I would spend time with them because it would teach me, oh, wise ones. I want to know what it is you're looking for. And so it really helped develop my career to understand that. And in the underwriting world, credibility is how they live, right? How much can I forecast? Well, if I can't get there with, let's say, 100, 200, 300 life group, where I can forecast credibility to the 100% certainty, I'm going to meld them with a bunch of other groups until I get enough numbers where the law of large numbers plays in and I can forecast risk. Mm-hmm. Now, where am I going with that? It's a long way around the barn to get to this. A captive is effectively who am I pooling with everyone else. So if you're fully insured, guess whose captive you're in?
Just whoever
your fully insured carrier is, right? You're pooled with other companies because if you're a 100, 200, 300 life company and you're with Blue Cross, there's too much risk there to just say, here's your risk factor. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a whole bunch of companies like you. We're going to put you with other companies until we get to the number that we think is big enough that we can predict the future and manage the volatility of risk. They've created their own captive. If you're self-funded by yourself, going to, I don't know, Sun Life, QBE, HCC, insert reinsurance carrier here. If you're a 200, 300, 400 life group, what they're going to do is say, well, wait a minute. You're not really big enough for me to just say we're going to go it alone because one end-stage renal disease or a transplant or something like that, we're skewing this way very much the wrong way. So what those stop-loss carriers are going to do is they're going to create pools. And then whether they're doing it through an MGU, whether they're doing that direct, they're creating a stop-loss pool, and they're creating, in effect, their own captive. Mm-hmm. Now, whether that's a legal captive or not, who knows? But that's the way that they're structuring the pool. Now, when you get into what we call the modern-day captive as well, today in the healthcare side, it's when employers recognize, they have that aha moment that I am not going it alone. As much as I think I might be, I'm not going it alone. And so I need to go to market with others and share risk with others to do two things: to allow me to support them in their bad years and them to support me in my bad years, and to effectively what we say is reduce the year-over-year volatility. Mm-hmm. And that's, in effect, what modern-day captives have become, of the ability for employers to know who they're pooled with so that we can march together towards the same common goal, which is reduced volatility, better buying power, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, more predictability and renewals, right. Those sorts of things. So, the captive arrangement, though, involves multiple layers, right? There's the initial stop-loss layer that is a per-employer layer, correct? The spec layer. And there's also a shared risk layer. So could you help maybe explain what the differences is between those two things?
Yeah, so great question. So captives can be structured one of two ways, really. What's called a quota share. So this is I'll explain it in a different way, or just effectively a captive layer and then the reinsurance layer. So in a captive, if I'm an employer, let's say I'm a 150 life employer, I am going to receive a stop loss contract directly from the reinsurance company, whoever that reinsurance company is. But I'm also going to join a captive that says that while the reinsurer is issuing me a policy at whatever said stop loss level is, so let's just say it's a $100,000 stop loss, that whatever the captive is agreed to as the shared risk is really where the reinsurer is taking risk, and that I'm sharing risk with the rest of the captive members. So I'm going to use round numbers because I don't want to take socks and shoes off today. Yep. So let's say I had a reinsurance policy premium of $100, right? Well, the reinsurer, the captive reinsurer, is going to say, well, that would normally buy you, let's say, a $100,000 stop loss policy. But the captive is actually going to share the risk above whatever your stop loss policy is, and let's say $250,000, so $250,000. So the captive is effectively on me going to take $150,000 of shared risk on the spec level, whereas I'm taking the $100,000. So the reinsurer is going to issue me the policy at $100,000. And that's what I'm going to pay. A portion of my premiums, though, is actually going in the captive layer because that's the shared risk piece, and the rest is going to the excess layer, which is the reinsurer themselves. The captive has an agreement with the reinsurer that it will indemnify the reinsurer for whatever the risk is between my $100,000 and the $250,000. And so if you think of a captive, what the reinsurer then is doing is saying, all right, let's say we have 100 employers and they're all doing this, and they may have different risk levels. So one's taking a $100,000 stop loss, one's taking a $50,000 stop loss, one's taking a $75,000, maybe one's taking $150,000. And they're going to use the same actuarial factors to determine the premium, but they're saying, in reality, we're going to issue the pool a $250,000 risk position. Okay. We're going to take all that money that would buy premium underneath that amount, and we're going to put it in a shared bucket. And when a claim comes in over whatever the reinsurance amount is, up to that $250,000, for example, we're going to dip into that bucket. We're going to go pay the claim. At the end of the year, we're going to look in the bucket. And whatever's left in that bucket, that goes back to the captive members. Now, the reality is, and we'll talk about it, hopefully we can get into this, is because I'm cautious of those captives that are always claiming, hey, we're giving back huge dividends. Well, to me, that's the same people that get excited about getting big tax refunds. That means you just gave the money to get it back.
Well, the experience refund component of a stop loss contract I always thought was a little bit misleading, because they're charging you a load to potentially give you some money back, which is why I always prefer the X-Spec, which we don't have to go into that too much. But you're buying more premium to hopefully get a little bit more back if you do well. Yeah. Like that doesn't compute in my head as why that's actually a value proposition to the employer. Yeah. So anyways, it sounds like it's the same sort of mentality of what you were just describing.
Yeah, no, it really is. And so the reality is, while that dividend capability is nice to have in the event that, hey, maybe the manuals were off. Maybe the reinsurance carrier did collect too much. Maybe we had a 2020 COVID-like year where everybody was sitting at home, and so now I'm going to have the opportunity to get some of that back. But the reality is, the real value of the captive is that volatility buffer. It's the ability to say, hey, if I have, or I should say when I have, my bad year, I am pooled with others who are going to lift me up to protect me. So it doesn't mean that I'm not going to see increases. It means that my level of increase is not going to be as erratic as it would be on my own, because if I've got, let's say that the captive layer itself is, $100 million of premium, right? That's a big captive, but there's certainly some that are out there that are that big and even bigger. Then that end-stage renal disease, it really isn't as big of a deal. Now, if I were going it alone, I was a 150 life employer, yeah, that's a big deal. And now I have the potential of lasers and things like that can come on. So the captive really gives you buying power to go to market as a big group, to protect the volatility, and to allow you to collaborate with one another in a common goal. And this is where I say captives that will allow just anybody to do anything they want probably aren't the best captives to be in. You want a captive that's got other captive members that are bought into this idea that the only way to truly reduce costs is to reduce the number of claims that we're consuming or the price of the claims. And we need to be engaged in those two things. And if you have an employer that's not, you probably don't want them in your captive, because that means everything that they're doing is going to impact you. Now that, again, nobody can cure cancer yet. So that's going to happen. Bad claims are going to happen. But it's the ones that you can eliminate that are important, and make sure that you've got protections in place when that cancer claim comes, that it's being paid appropriately, it's being managed appropriately. So these are some of the unique things you can do if you're in a captive.
Yeah, no, I love the fact that there seems to be, with the groups that you're describing, the arrangement that you're set up, that these folks do have skin in the game, maybe is the appropriate way to, we are buying in not only to this funding mechanism, but we're buying into the approach to combating claims, to, proactively implementing cost containment components, which I'm sure you'll touch on a little bit. But it's more than just simply, here's where my dollars go. There's maybe a behavioral component that seems to be included when you buy into a captive, or at least one that's set up for the correct reasons. Right?
Yeah, again, it's funny. So we got into the captive space really 2013, 2014.
Okay.
And it was one of those things like, okay, what's a health captive? I mean, your captives were very familiar in the P&C world, but people really didn't know much about it on the healthcare side. I mean, at that time, there were probably less than a dozen healthcare captives, and maybe only 4 or 5 that were doing it well. And so that was really where things were. You fast forward to today, like that train left the station,
Yes.
and now everybody's on it.
Yes.
Because it's the new fad. And in our industry, God love us, we are notorious for shiny object syndrome. Like squirrel led that, and we're always looking for that silver bullet. And I tell clients this all the time. There is no such thing as a silver bullet. And a captive is not the silver bullet. It is a product that is part of the overall process, that if you have the right process in place and strategy in place, it can be a tool. It can be a bullet in the gun. But if you're looking for that one silver bullet, you're never going to find it.
Yeah.
And so you've got to just make sure you've got all the right pieces in place. And captives certainly can be one of those. I'm obviously a huge proponent of it. But with the emergence of so many captives out there now, buyer beware, because you got to make sure that the fundamentals of whoever's managing that captive, who's actually putting the captive out there, what are their incentives for doing that? And it's an evolving market. So, the things that might have been great 3 or 4 years ago may not be as great now, because what needs to happen is the captive needs to constantly be evolving as the market evolves as well.
Well, so, you had me down the train of thinking of a qualification process, right? So what is the kind of that pre-qualification? Is this appropriate for you as an employer? Kind of walk me through some of the things that you're going to talk to a group about to make sure they actually are a good fit for what you're doing.
Yeah. So, listen, I always start with the numbers, right? So again, and now, from a captive perspective, again, I would argue that any employer that's less than 500 lives trying to enter into the self-funded space should be in some type of captive or captive-like program.
Okay.
Where they understand that, because again, and I could argue that maybe even up to 1,000 lives, but we'll say 500 for purposes. Because again, once you get above 500 lives, now you're looking at the client differently. But if you're below 500 lives and you're going to the reinsurance market, perfectly fine to do that. And certainly we've taken clients there direct as well. But you are adopting a new layer of risk that you might be able to manage out, either if you were in a captive or you were in a risk retention group or something that allowed you the ability to spread risk. Because at under 500 lives, if you're going directly to the reinsurance market, you're not going alone. You just don't know who you're going with because they're pooling you with somebody. And so under that 500, that's kind of the key criteria. If you're under 500 lives, you need to be in some type of pooling mechanism, whether that's a captive, whether it's a risk group, whether it's an MGU that's going to be transparent about their processes, something like that. And so from there, then it's really walking the client through what type of program, right? Are you going to want to have a risk component? Are you going to want to be willing to put up capital? Because if maybe some of you don't. Some of the clients say, hey, listen, I don't really care to have a risk position beyond what I'm paying in premiums. I don't care about the dividend capabilities. So maybe that's important. Some of the captives are going to have different contract languages, right? So, as you talk about on the stop loss, is it a 12-12, a 12-15, a 12-18? Is there TLO? What is the run out component? All of those different things are important. So really, as we're looking at a client and trying to determine what is the right program for them, it's really all of those components that we're really trying to determine. And then the final component, which a lot of people don't talk about, whatever the captive is, still has an underwriting process of manuals. And sometimes the manuals are just off. So while we have predominantly one captive that we work with primarily just because they've been a long-term partner with us, we've We've gone through the trenches with them, we'll say. We've grown together. We recognize that there are times, though, they're not the right fit. Not because I don't think that they might have the best mousetrap, but at the end of the day, you still have an underwriter that's looking at the case and going, I just don't like these cases right now. I'm just not feeling it. And you need to have another alternative solution.
Well, so that actually leads me to a question I wasn't really anticipating. So in a captive, is that the responsibility of a single underwriter? Because when I was selling stop loss for a single case basis, right, you're working with one underwriter. Maybe the manager has to approve certain discretion, but is there a single underwriter that's really in charge of the captive renewals as well, or a single sell of a captive? Or
yeah, it really just depends.
Okay.
It depends on whoever the reinsurer is that's partnering with that captive has set it up. So if you have, again, you're infusing a new player into the mix. You've got the captive manager, and then you have the reinsurer. Now, interestingly enough, and this is kind of an interesting move we've seen over the last number of years, is the reinsurers are now creating their own captives.
Okay.
So, the used to, you would have these groups of people that would come together, they'd form captive documents, they'd enter into an arrangement, a legal arrangement governed by the SEC and the governments when there's shares issued and all of that. So you have to follow the criteria. You can onshore it, you can offshore it. I mean, there's a number of different routes here. The reinsurance market realized, hey, we may be losing some market share here. What if we effectively created our own captives, allowing employers to come together to pool risk, to take a risk position? We're just managing it inside of our own ecosystem. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say that there's not value there, but I'm cautious of it.
Yeah.
Right? So again, every organization is different. You need to look at them. How are they structured? How are they managing their financials? Where are the incentives appropriately? I'm not saying that everyone shouldn't have the opportunity to make money. If we didn't, nobody'd be in business. So I'm okay with the reinsurer making money. How much money? Where are the margins?
Yes.
Right? Where's the spread? What is the layer of protection that the captive is getting? What are the protocols and the levers that can be pulled? I personally like the ability to have a captive that is not run by the reinsurer or the TPA.
Is that the proverbial fox guarding the hen house to a degree?
little bit, in my opinion. And again, that's my opinion.
Yeah,
and you could probably get a dozen people on here that would argue a different point. Just personally, the more checks and balances there are, the more the happier I am.
Well, and that's something we touched on with Jonathan earlier in the podcast, talking about Meritain and the independent TPA.
Yeah.
There's something to be said with independence in the transaction as well. If a carrier is setting up their own captive, well, they're doing it in a way that's going to benefit them predominantly, right? And hopefully the employer has a good experience so they stay, but the carrier is numero uno in that equation, not necessarily the employer.
Yeah. Now, to that point, again, to each his own. Maybe their overhead expenditure of managing that captive is going to be lower, right?
Could be.
Understandably so. There's fewer connectivities. There's fewer mouths to feed. So if you've got somebody who's very price sensitive on the overhead cost of managing the plan, I can see where they might do it. Now, in that same breath, I would say if you have somebody that's overly focused on the administrative cost, then they are misinformed as to the real thing that they need to be focused on. But nonetheless, I mean, again, I think that there are many different options out there, which is great. And what employers need to do predominantly, and consultants who are advising those employers, is recognize that each employer is unique and different, and they need to be looking at the right solution specifically for that employer. Well,
and so we've talked about the pieces that make up a self-funded plan: the administrator, the PBM if it's carved out, the stop-loss carrier, of course, the employer. Captives introduce an additional, a person in that equation or an entity in that equation, the captive manager. So what is that captive manager's role in setting up or managing a captive? Yeah,
so the captive manager's role is really making sure that that layer is managed appropriately amongst the members. So, again, it is a new player in the mix, right? So it's another layer. It's another expense because there's going to be a layered expense on top. They got to get paid. They got to be, able to be paid for what they're doing. But their job is really to make sure that ecosystem is, I like to say, rowing in the right direction. We've all, most people have been in a canoe. If you've ever been in a canoe with somebody who's not in sync with you, you typically just kind of spin round and round. So a good captive manager is one that's able to take all of these very oftentimes type A owners, business leaders, and say, here is a common objective for us to try to accomplish together, and recognize that. They also need to be able to manage the financial interest between the members who they represent and the reinsurer who they need to be in alignment with to make sure that the risk is appropriately allocated.
Okay.
And so the role of the captive manager is really to do that. It's to be that almost second layer of consulting advisor on top of a plan to say, hey, you have a consultant, you have an advisor, you have a broker that is managing your program. We're going to sit behind them to make sure that all of the other people you're pooled with are in alignment in as much of a way as possible. And in some cases, it's their job to make sure that the reinsurance contracts are in alignment with what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes that needs to change. Sometimes people need to get voted off of the captive island.
Okay.
And sometimes that's the captive manager's role, is to recognize those. So really, they're the glue that kind of makes it all work, and they are the most critically important component, in my opinion. Which is, as I've mentioned, the reason we work with one predominantly that we've worked with, in large part because we trust how they approach the business, and we'll call it their intellectual capabilities.
Well, and you bring up an interesting segue, because we've talked about maybe the appropriate size group and the appropriate risk profile to enter a captive. The other equation that you just touched on is the exiting a captive, and maybe sometimes that gets brought up as a potential roadblock or an impediment or an objection or whatever you want to call it. Hey, don't go in a captive. They're very difficult to exit. So I'm sure you've experienced groups that had to leave for one reason or another, outgrew a captive, got kicked out off the island, like you said. So what does that process maybe look like for them to leave? Yeah,
man, I'm so glad you asked that question, because as I'm talking to prospective clients and clients all the time, whether they're going to enter a captive or not, whether they're just going into the self-funded world, whether they're fully insured, whatever their situation is, I am always telling them, whatever entrance strategy you need to focus just as much on the exit strategy, because whatever you're doing today may not be what you need to do tomorrow. Maybe what you're doing today, or what we're about to do, will be something you do for the next 20, 30 years. What do you do when that ends? Mm-hmm. What do you do if that's only 20 or 30 months, right? So it is critically important when you're evaluating a captive, just like when you're evaluating a stop-loss contract. What's my out clause here, right? So, listen, and I know you could run circles around me on the stop-loss side of things, but, when I look at a group that says, oh, yeah, well, my broker advised me on a 12-12 contract, I'm like, really? How's their crystal ball?
Yeah.
Because when you're in a 12-12 contract, you've got an unfunded liability.
Yeah, what are you doing next year? You already need to know what you're doing next year.
Yeah, exactly. You're guaranteed to either be assuming a ton of risk or renewing. Mm-hmm. In some way, shape, or form. Maybe you move stop-loss carrier and they take a run-in risk, but you're going to have to make a decision based on your risk profile. So, that is a critical component even when you're entering the captive. What do I do to get out of it? What is the stop-loss contract that I'm issued by the reinsurer that is in alignment with the captive going to offer me the ability to get out, and how? What are you doing with my capital? When do I get that back, right? What is the process there? All these are very important questions. And I always tell, again, whether it's a captive, whether it's reinsurance, whether it's stop, buyer beware. You need to understand, how do I get out of this when that time comes? And if there is not clarity around that, go look elsewhere.
Yes.
There's a reason there's not clarity. It's a golden handcuff.
Don't worry about getting out.
You never want to get out. Yeah. Read the agreement. Yeah. What does it say? What does it mean? That's very, very important.
Well, of course, obviously leaning on your consultant, right, to be able to educate you. I imagine this, just listening to this in the podcast and people out there that are listening, I mean, this is, you said it's not a difficult subject, but I think it's just the jargon and the nomenclature is something that's new to folks. But I imagine for the smaller employers that have been fully insured, going and educating about this process, because could this sometimes be a multi-year educational sales cycle in order to get them comfortable moving to this arrangement?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's interesting, and I think that just in my own personal portfolio, I've probably got somewhere between 70 and 80 clients in some form of a captive. Okay. Right? Every one of them was in a different buying phase when you met with them. There's some of them you meet with and they're day one. Let's do it. This sounds great. I get it. I understand it. This is what I want to do. There's some of them go, all right. The big question we get a lot of times is, I don't know whether or not I want my risk to be pooled with somebody else. What if they have a bad? What if they? And of course, my response is, dude, you already are.
Yeah.
You just don't know who they are.
Yeah.
Right. So don't kid yourself. You're not going it alone. No, as much as you want, you're not going it alone. Unless maybe you've got 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 employees. Now we're having a different conversation. But in that under 1,000 employee basis, Rarely are you going it alone, and under 500, you're never going it alone. Let's just be real. So really, it's getting them to a place where they understand that, I think, is the sales cycle. Sometimes that can be quick. Sometimes that can be long-term. HR managers, tough on this conversation, right? Again, and this is nothing against HR folks, but most of them are wearing way too many hats to try to wrap their head around all these layers. This is a C-suite conversation to understand how the components work, how the financing component. Let's remember, being in a captive does nothing to your claims. I don't care if you're in a captive, fully insured, or self-funded. Cancer is cancer. And whether or not, whatever your funding mechanism is, won't change that cancer one iota. Right. So it is a mechanism on how I'm going to finance whatever risks I'm taking. And so that is really where you have to get a client into the understanding of, all right, all healthcare that is insured is just healthcare that is financed, right? And so where effectively, what's the difference between Visa, American Express, MasterCard, so on and so forth, right? There's reasons you pick one or the other. Same thing applies to the captive, same thing applies to stop loss, same thing applies to fully insured or self-funded. You've got to understand, what is it that I'm willing to finance, how am I going to finance it, what's the best model for me to finance it? And that's what takes time sometimes, getting a client on board with.
Well, and do you think, let's say the client is ready to proceed, what is the sort of lead time to the effective date that you need to transition them into a captive? Is it additional rather than just fully insured to self-funded, or is it kind of the same lead time?
Yeah, it really can be the same lead time as if you were going self-funded.
Well, I would presume if there's an existing captive that they're entering into, it's probably a little different than maybe trying to set one up instead.
Oh yeah,
or build,
that's a whole different
that's a whole
conversation.
different.
But let's say there's an existing captive and you wanting to enter into it, right? Then that normal process is the same as if you were leaving the fully insured going to self-funded. If you're self-funded moving from one stop loss carrier to another, there's an additional document need to review, right? The captive document. What is the captive? What are the documents? How is that going to apply here? But that's really it. But listen, I tell everybody, you don't want to make gut check decisions on this that are, hey, let's do it and let's implement it in 30 days. Have I done that? Yeah. Do you hate me in the process? Yeah. And I probably hate me in the process too. This is something I recommend anybody. Let's take it in a couple different ways. If you're fully insured looking at going into a captive, you need 6 months.
Okay.
If you are self-funded going into a captive, minimum 90 days. Right. And that's because if you're self-funded, you already have some structure, right? You're understanding I'm taking a risk position on all the claims up to the stop loss level. You kind of get stop loss. You're looking at the reinsurance contracts. You kind of got the TPA possibly in place, all of those things. But if you're going fully insured and self-funded, that needs to be a 6-month decision. I've done it inside of that, like I've mentioned, but the window of, okay, we want all of our clients specifically to really understand what it is they're getting into and really understand how they get out of it. And that educational process often is a lot more than one phone call. And then again, remember, if you're leaving fully insured going into a captive, you're leaving fully insured going self-funded going into a captive. So there's a number of pieces of that puzzle versus if you're already self-funded going into a captive. That's really a few, not as many layers.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm just envisioning, educating a group about this, me and whiteboards. Like I would probably have to be up there with the layers and, like arrows, God knows what to you mentioned, taking off your socks.
You've been to my presentation.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm trying to copy your presentation. No.
But there is a lot of that, though, Spencer. I mean, you bring up a great point. Yeah. Again, I always say the best advisors and consultants in the world are those that are educators.
Agree.
Right? And if you're doing the job educating appropriately, you're bringing credibility to your craft, and nothing good is ever done in the dark, right? Everybody needs to know what everybody's roles are. And listen, if I'm meeting with a new prospect, I'm very clear on the first call. At the end of the day, I want you to hire me. So let's just go ahead and get that out of the way. Eventually, whether that's in the first call, second call, third call, fourth call, I'm going to be asking for your business. Now, what you and I need to determine along the way is how much conversation we need to have before I ask.
Yeah.
Right? And typically, I say this all the time, I don't want to sell you anything. I want you to want to buy something.
Well, yeah, people don't want to be sold, but they do want to buy.
That's right.
You're totally right.
You do that through education and information.
Yeah. Totally agree. And I think we could continue down the path of captives, but I don't want to leave you here forever. But I do feel obligated to ask you while you're here, what drove the foray into the media world? We started kind of there with the podcast. So let's end. I'm curious to hear, the attraction to that and the kind of the why and your experience, because as somebody that's clearly attracted to this medium as well, what was the motivator there?
Well, I like to say I kind of fell into it, but I will tell you, so, and I'll try to make this as abbreviated as possible. So in 2016, 2017, I really went through this gut check moment of burnout. And, again, I'd left the firm I was at the end of 2010, 2011, started this firm, had to learn how to be a business owner, had to learn how to grow it. I tell people I went through what was called the terrible twos of growing the firm. And if not for the executive team around me and our team, I'd be out of the business. I have no doubt about that. Matter of fact, in 2016, 2017, I think I approached John and said, hey, you want my half six-pack and a Happy Meal and it's yours because I'm just done. And for me, it was I became so splintered trying to be all things to all people. I was nothing great to anyone. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was taking a step back and realizing that I needed to do two things. I needed to realize, first and foremost, what gave me relevance. And second of all, I needed to find enthusiasm in it. And I am a firm believer that knowledge breeds confidence. Confidence breeds enthusiasm, and enthusiasm sells. And so for me, kind of working backwards, if I wanted to be enthusiastic about something, which is something people wanted to be part of, I had to be confident, not arrogant. There's a difference there.
There's a fine line, too.
There's a fine line. Yep. But most arrogance is a result of lack of confidence and knowledge.
100% agree.
So if you're sensing that somebody's super arrogant, they probably don't know what they're talking about. But if they're confident in it, in a way that's not aggressive, they probably know their stuff. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was kind of going backwards. And then secondarily, recognizing that I didn't want to just be an expert in health insurance. I want to be an expert in healthcare and business and what was going on there. So for me, it was kind of clearing the slate and realizing what was the best thing that I could do for my organization was find a way to be enthusiastic once again. How do I do that? I need to build up my confidence once again. How do I do that? I need to develop my knowledge. And so I really started doing that. I started developing my knowledge, reading everything I could get a hands on. It's when I started getting up at 4:30 in the morning, which I still do religiously. And I found that time to find the energy to do what I wanted to do, to engross myself in knowledge and education. And from there, the word started getting out that, hey, this guy kind of knows some stuff.
Yeah.
So in 2018, February of 2018, it was announced that Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan, and Chase Manhattan were going to do something in healthcare. Nobody knew what it was. And I think they announced it like at 4 o'clock right after the markets closed. It was a brilliant PR move, right? And everybody's spinning, ripping their hair out. And so, interestingly enough, I get up at 4:30, right? I wake up and I've got an email from somebody who I'd recognize the name, but I didn't know exactly who this person was. I'm like, I know that name. It was an email. And it said, Seth, got your name from somebody who says you might know what's going on with this. Any thoughts? And it was a link to a CNBC article about this. So, of course, I read the article. I knew it was, nobody knows what's going on. Here's what I think may be happening. Mm-hmm. And here's what I think is going to happen in the short term. Here's what I think is going to happen in the long term. Here's why I think that it could work. Here's why I think it ultimately won't. And I just wrote it all down, and I sent it to him. Well, 7 hours later, I was on Fox News talking about it.
Yeah.
In the next 12 months, I did 300 media segments. In the 12 months that followed that, I did almost 400. And this year I'm on track to do something similar. And so, but what was interesting about that, it was twofold. And this is really what I think has been the driving force behind it. And it's been a good thing. One is, first and foremost, is it drives me to continuously develop my knowledge. I can't sit back because last thing you want to do is get on national television in front of millions of people and vomit at the mouth. And I've done that. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure if you went and Googled enough segments, you'd find one where I did. But you can't BS them either. Like you got to know your stuff, and you got to do it with a level of confidence. But you also have to understand that there's navigational ways to, when you don't know what you're talking about, to get out of it. And so you have to kind of refine that art. But really what was beneficial of that was twofold. One is third-party validation, right? If I go meet with a prospective client, I don't have to tell them I know what I'm talking about. you can Google me, and you probably already did, and you're going to find that Fox News, CNN, don't worry, we'll go on both. It's okay. Whatever your political spectrum is, we'll be fine. We preach to Christians and heathens. Whatever that is, we'll go tell them. Second of all is, if you always tell the truth, you never have to remember what you say, so you can't ever go off of that. And second of all, one of the things that I think has propelled me throughout the media is I'm just a hick from West Texas. And I don't have the luxury of using big words. I try to make it simple. And it was funny because I'll tell you this quick story, Spencer. So, I've always been kind of known as the healthcare guy in the media. The very first time I was on Fox and Friends, earpiece in my ear, and the anchor comes on and goes, well, President Trump has just recently signed a trade deal with the country of Mexico. Here to discuss is business and market analyst Seth Denson.
Yeah, that's when the record scratches, right?
I went,
word.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
And immediately starts asking me about this trade deal. Now, thank God, I get up at 4:30, and the first thing I do is open the Wall Street Journal. And I start reading. And then I go to CNBC, and I start reading. I'm not reading just about healthcare. Don't worry, I read my fair share of JAMA articles, too. But I want to know what's going on in the business sector, because this is what's going to impact my clients. I want to know what's going on in the global economy. I need to know all these things. If I go back over the last year and I count the number of segments I've done related to healthcare versus the ones that I've done related to just basic economics, 85 to 90% of it has been basic economics. And so what's interesting is after I did that, I called the producer right after that. Because, by the way, news anchors, God love them. It's the producers that are really figuring out the segments. And a lot of the great anchors really are involved. But so I called the producer after. I was like, what the heck were you doing? I'm a healthcare guy. First of all, you call me a business and market analyst. And second of all, I mean, I guess you could say, yes, I am. But second of all, you asked me questions that were not healthcare related. And they're like, we knew you could handle it. And we knew this topic needed somebody that would be able to speak straight and not use big words and make it where people can understand.
Right.
And that's been really what I've been doing out there ever since. And I will tell you, it has made me better in the healthcare space because, listen, healthcare is a sixth of the U.S. economy. Guess what that means? There are 5/6 of other things.
Yeah.
And those are the things that can also directly impact my clients. So if I have a well-balanced knowledge around what's going on and the impact, I can help them. I'm talking a lot these days about inflation, about the impact of China on the global economy, things like that. I now have an article, column on newsmax.com. I'm fortunate to get to write on a weekly basis. And all of that really has to do with the ability, going back to that thing of knowledge breeds confidence, enthusiasm sells.
Well, it's interesting, whether or not you proactively sought it or, the universe sought you, depending on the way you look at it. I think the point is you were ready for it, if does that make sense. So, maybe 10 years ago, if you had the motivation to get there, you may not have been at a point where you could credibly talk about all these things, and you wouldn't get on that segment that all of a sudden you got blindsided by a question you didn't expect, and then you were able to handle it. So, there's something to that. Yes, you have a thirst for knowledge. Yes, you have the experience that you built up, but you also just very likely were at a point in your life, just as an outsider looking at and hearing your story, that you were prepared for the moment as well. And I just, very much respect what you've done. I think it's, as somebody that knows you, and we've known each other for a few years now, it's cool to watch, right? And I think it's very, I'm very happy that you've made this foray into it, and it's been very successful as well. Do you feel like, is there ever where you can't serve two masters and you go all in one direction or the other, or do you think it's still something you can handle both?
Listen, I'm very cognizant to recognize that time is the great equalizer for everyone, and that at this phase in my life, that great equalizer is allowing me to do both. If at any point it comes where I have to choose, I'll make a choice based on what I think is best for me, my family, and where I feel I'm going to be the most relevant. My father mentioned something to me early on in my career when I was trying to figure out what it is I wanted to do. And he said something to me that resonated. It didn't resonate for about 10 years, but it was that Jerry Maguire moment that I had was when it started resonating again. He said, son, just do me a favor. Promise me you'll never chase money because you'll never catch it. Find something else you do vocationally with your career, in your life, that gives you relevance. And as long as I'm following that passion of where I find relevance, whether that's in the media, whether that's in healthcare and insurance and business consulting or anything like that, that's what I'm going to pursue. And I've been blessed enough to get to pursue it.
Well, I think it's important to remember that enthusiasm that you talked about. You can tell when it's faked. You can tell when somebody's trying to project enthusiasm or get salesy on you, or
Right.
if it's valid, if it's authentic. That's what I think we're all chasing for in our careers, is to wake up every day and go, I can't wait to get started with what I need to do today, rather than some dread or something to that effect. So,
Right.
only time will tell. And of course, obviously you'll decide what it is ultimately that is the right fit. Where can folks find you? We've talked about GDP Advisors. We talked about NewsMax and Fox. Outside of that, what's the best place to get connected with you and John?
Yeah. So, listen, GDPadvisors.com is the website. SethDenson.com is my own website. You get to the point where people tell you have to have your own. I was fortunate enough that I was able to buy the domain before anybody knew who I was, and still maybe only my mom knows, but nonetheless, I was able to buy the domain. And then, wherever all of those social media things that I love to hate, Twitter, Instagram,
LinkedIn,
Facebook, all of those things.
And then also, last but not least, The Cure. Do you want to talk about where people can find a copy of that as well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so The Cure, I love. I was so blessed to get to write that book, and I did it. And if you haven't read it, you should. But if you let me preface what it is. I wrote The Cure as a result of watching the Republicans try to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. And for those of you that know me or have heard me say things, that the Affordable Care Act I was no big fan of. I will take anything and look for the positives, and there were certainly some we can garnish from that. But with what the Republicans were trying to roll out, I was no more of a fan of in reality, because I looked at it and went, yeah, that's not going to do it either. And so I literally sat down one night and wrote the outline, effectively what was the white paper that became The Cure, as the blueprint for solving. If Congress was serious about this, if they really wanted to tackle healthcare, here is simple steps they could take to do it. It ain't rocket science. It's math, economics, people's engagement and intelligence. You do these things, you could do it. So I wrote the book as a blueprint to give to Congress to say, here, guys and gals.
Well, I remember you saying you wrote it in a way that you hoped politicians would be able to understand.
Yeah, if I could have used pictures and colors, I would have. But I had to write it in a simple way that even Congress could understand.
Fair
yes. And so I tried to write it in a way that's an easy read. It's funny. My first draft of it was 500 pages. My editor came back and said, nobody wants to read a 500-page book on healthcare, especially healthcare policy. So you got to scrap it. And God love her, Tammy Kling and her team, they were fantastic. They cut that sucker down to like 140 pages by the time they were done with it. And it's funny because right after I did that, I got kind of called out by someone in the industry, said, how could you solve healthcare in 140 pages? I'm like, well, 2,000 pages of the Affordable Care Act didn't do it, so let's try short.
Yeah.
But no, so that's why I wrote it. It really is a blueprint. You can find it anywhere you get your books, Amazon. You can go to my website and get it. Barnes & Noble's, Target, any place that's got it, you can buy it.
Awesome. Well, Seth, it is Friday afternoon, and I know you've got some grocery shopping to do,
I do,
and a weekend to get started on, myself included. So, again, appreciate you coming, man. Really great to see you, and hope to have you again soon.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate your friendship, your intelligence, your knowledge, what you're doing for the industry, man. It's not all, listen, one of the things I will tell you I do in the mornings when I look to see if Spencer's got a new podcast out. If he does, I'm listening to it.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Much respect. Thank you, sir. All right.
Thanks, buddy.
Bye.